Okay, yep, so welcome folks. As you are joining us, please go over to Slido and answer the question that we have up there, which is, what types of research artifacts have you cited in your work? And it looks like things have evened out a bit, so we're gonna jump in now. So welcome everybody. This session is titled Movie Credits for Data and Other Research Artifacts, and it's brought to you by the ESIP Research Artifact Citation Cluster. So we have a notes document that we'll be working in throughout today, and if you guys could go over there and add your name as a participant, and just to make sure you are you have access to that notes document, because that's where we'll also be taking notes for our breakout session. And yeah, just wanted to let you know that by participating in this session, basically you're agreeing to adhere to the ESIP community participation guidelines, and we have a link to those on our notes document. And if there are any issues, there's also a link on that notes document to report an issue. I've asked everybody to go over to Slido and answer this question just to get us warmed up. So I'm going to hop over there and see what we have. So we asked, what types of research artifacts have you cited in your work? And looks like literature, as I would expect, is on top, but tied with data, which is incredible. Means that we're gaining steam in the data citation world. But we also have folks who have cited software. There are folks who have cited ontologies and vocabularies, as well as samples and learning resources. And there are some other things out there that folks are citing as well. And let's see, I can't see what the results are for none of the above, but it looks like it's very small, if anything. And so it looks like most of us have cited something in our work, which is great, because we are going to be talking about citation, so you'll already have a head start in understanding what we're, the major concept here is that it's, important to cite work for a number of different reasons that Mark is going to go into. So with that, I'm going to hop back over to our slides. Thank you for taking that poll. And Mark, I'm going to pass things over to you to give a little background on our session here.
Oh, these do not appear to be the most current slides, but that's okay. First off, let me offer my welcome as well, everybody. I'm Mark Parsons. I'm affiliated with the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Normally, I would be coming at you from the unceded lands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. But for this week, I have the rare privilege of being on the island of Muniwanakanning in Lake Superior, Gitchagumi, on the lands of the Ojibwe of the Assiniboine. Beautiful, wonderful place that we're really privileged to occupy, quite frankly. I also want to make sure, if you haven't heard already, that by participating in this session, you've already agreed to adhere to the ESIP community participation guidelines. I'm sure those have been spread around, and that everybody will be a pleasant human. So, but jumping in to the background. Oh, and I just wanted to also offer, throw your own name in the chat, throw your affiliation, the lands you occupy. If you're unsure, native-land.ca will tell you whose lands you're sitting on. And then to jump into things as background, the Research Artifact Citation Cluster has been around for a few years now, but data citation has been an issue for ESIP for a long time. And we developed and published data citation guidelines more than a decade ago, and then we updated them a couple of years ago in 2019. And, my bias notwithstanding, I do think that these are some of the most comprehensive and robust citation guidelines out there. We also have developed guidelines for citation of software and services that are beginning to get greater attention as well. That was also a couple of years. And I would argue that the basic issues of data citation in particular, and maybe even software citation, have really been resolved, but some issues remain. And so if you go to the next slide, please. And these issues really stem from what we mean by citation. And we've been using this definition that came originally from CODATA and ICSTE, the International Council on Scientific and Technical Information, and that where data citation is a reference to data for the purpose of credit, attribution, and facilitation of access to the data. So this is really important. There's at least 3 concerns that we're trying to address within citation. Reference, pointing to the actual thing. Credit attribution, who deserves credit for developing the thing, and then access to the thing. And of course, there's many other things. There's tracking impact, there's tracking provenance, but at the very core, we have these at least 3 basic concerns, which are often in tension with each other. And that's what we've really been struggling with within the cluster, is really teasing out those separate concerns and for different types of artifacts. So next slide. And so our initial work, we tried to take a step back. So we'd worked on data citation, we'd worked on software citation, both of which are roughly modeled off the concept of literature citation. And we wanted to take a step back and consider this broader issue of addressing all those concerns that I pointed out for all the different types of research artifacts, or at least most of the different types of research artifacts. And so as an initial sort of brainstorming exercise, we identified 32 different research artifacts. And we originally called them research objects, but that has a very specific meaning in some communities. So we've started using this somewhat awkward term, research artifacts, but things that are produced as a result of research. And then we began to separate the concerns that citation tries to address, including reference, credit, reproducibility, impact, provenance, et cetera. And then we clustered those 32 different artifact types into 9 general categories that you see there. We're really not paying attention to literature. That's largely been addressed, and it's being well addressed by the library and publishing community. And we've really been focusing on those next 5. So data, software, samples, by which we mean physical samples, ontologies, vocabularies, semantic artifacts, and then what we've been calling complex research objects, particularly in the educational realms or learning resources that bring together multiple things like curricula, data, instructional materials, et cetera, but it could be a whole body of complex artifacts. And next slide. So we started by looking at those 5 high-level categories with the reference question. In other words, this precise identification of something, specifically or for trying to accommodate reproducibility, good open science. And our sort of takeaway on that, we were looking at, we asked the question of when is something become citable? When does something become an entity that is a referenceable entity? And perhaps not surprisingly, as we studied that was in an ESIP session a year and a half ago or so, that when something becomes a thing that, a citable, recognizable, first-class object is really very contextual. And furthermore, the name of that thing, the actual reference, the identifier, if you will, and the location, the access point, are often sometimes don't work in conjunction with each other until hopefully they're ultimately pulled under a referenceable persistent identifier, typically a DOI. And so the use case, how this is being done, is really critical for the different types of artifacts. And we sort of stopped there for most of the artifacts, except for data, which is really, I think, sort of our favorite. And we argue that the precise identification of data is largely addressed by the Research Data Alliance recommendation for citing dynamic data. And if you're interested in that, there's a couple references there. And these slides are, of course, available online. That top one is a brand spanking new, or no, the second one is a brand spanking new paper. It's in review right now. We just actually sent the revised version back. And it goes through a lot of case studies of how these are applied. So if you're interested in applying those recommendations, that's a really useful paper, I think. Next slide. So after looking at that reference question, and to a certain degree, the access question, we decided to dig into credit. And credit is a lot harder. We've spent the last 2 ESIP meetings trying to work on credit for the different artifacts. And it's, I think, especially important to note with earth science that so many of our artifacts, notably data, but all the other stuff as well, is often used in contexts well outside of scholarly publication. People are using earth science data to do, trivial things like save lives. And so trying to capture that sort of credit is even more challenging than when we're looking outside the classic citation context. And so in the last two ESIP sessions, we considered how this particular taxonomy that is used by the publishing world, the contributor roles terminology, might apply to these different artifacts. And we considered sort of 3 levels of credit. You could sort of think of it as high, medium, low, but the way we spelled it out is, the highest is you're included as an author, basically, in a citation. You are a leader in producing that artifact. The sort of second tier is in acknowledgements. And what is acknowledgements? In a paper, we know what that means. It's a little section at the end that says acknowledgements. It could be similar for a data set or for software, but it's sort of a second tier. And then finally, and this is where we sort of echo the the title of the session, the movie credits theme, is that it could be mentioned elsewhere in metadata, because there's a whole bunch of people that are involved in producing these artifacts, and it goes well beyond authorship. And next slide. Nope, not yet, sorry. Before we get into that next slide, I just wanted to say that the rest of this presentation, we're going to review this sort of credit situation for each artifact. And then we're going to return to data in more detail. We've sort of the cluster, in a sense, is coming full circle and returning back to the nuances of data citation. And we're going to really focus on what it means to be an author, a citable author of a data set. And Madison will tell you a lot more about how we're doing that. But before we do that, I just want to give you an update on where we are in looking at assigning credit for different artifacts. So now the next slide. And so this really should be presented by Dan Katz, but he's leading another session in ESIP right now, so I will do my best. And the bottom line is, for software, credit doesn't really work. I mean, the credit taxonomy, it doesn't really have the right level of detail. And moreover, the software community, not beyond just earth science, people who are developing software are working on this in different ways. And it's largely coordinated by the Force 11 Software Citation Working Group, which is linked there. If you're not familiar with Force 11, it's an international community looking at these sorts of issues of data and software sharing and publishing and so forth. But from a very generic standpoint, they're not looking at it from an earth science standpoint, they're looking at it across all disciplines. And then other work includes journals that promote software publishing, including one in particular that is edited by Dan, that focuses really on publishing the software itself with robust description, but it's not a paper as such. It is publishing the software, but it is peer reviewed and it is indexed and so forth. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, I encourage you to check out the Journal of Open Source Software. I think it's really pushing the boundaries of what it means to publish a journal. And then also, just as finally, I just thought this reference at the end by Elias de Cosmo et al., it goes into pretty nuanced discussion of how people create software and what sort of things should be credited. And you can't just count commits in GitHub, for example. And in fact, that can actually mislead you into different directions. Sometimes, someone who writes 2 lines of code, those might be the most important 2 lines of code in the whole program and deserve all sorts of things, all sorts of credit. And someone else might have done all sorts of work, formatting the code, neatening it up, doing all sorts of commits. They deserve credit, but it's not the same level. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, I commend you to that article. So that's me. I will now pass it to our next speaker, I believe is Ruth.
Yep, it is. And similarly, credit doesn't really work for semantic resources. And there's lots of issues there. A lot of the concepts don't translate. And I think there was a general feeling that it was kind of the whole square holes and round pegs and those kind of problems that we were having. I also note that the semantic community has been working on these sorts of issues for a good long time. There's many papers in that are involved. I did not give a list of papers that are discussing these, mostly because the slide wasn't that big. But the other issue is simply that semantic resources range the whole gamut from, glossaries that might be published in a PDF or a book or other kind of publication, which then would clearly be cited like, a publication, to more formal resources at sort of the other extreme that are written in a formal language like OWL or RDF or something. And those are typically housed on some sort of code repository like GitHub, but then also placed in a formal semantic resource repository, such as the Obo Foundry, BioPortal, and there's a bunch of them. And also, the community has started making a practice of including micro-citations for the larger, more well-curated ontologies and things of that note, where, for example, if you were the person who decided that some term had a particular definition and a particular set of axioms, or relationships, in other words, you would likely be microcited right in the annotations for that particular term. So like Envo has several thousand terms, I think, and I'm sure it doesn't have several thousand authors, but for example, I know that I've been microcited 40 or 50 times or something like that in that particular ontology. So when you go to a particular term, it has its own provenance, and literally provenance, because if it's deprecated, they have the reasons and all of that too. And moreover, there are ontologies of these sorts of things that have been developed. For example, the RDA Vocabulary Services Interest Group, which is fairly active, has a metadata for ontology description and publication ontology, which in other words, you have an ontology about how to create metadata for your ontology, and it'll be a profile of DCAT. And I left this little picture in here just to show that if you're doing ontologies properly, then everything all hooks up very nicely. And this is, in my opinion, the best way to start to achieve interoperability between all the various and sundry disciplines. So, next person.
Next up, we have Sarah, who's going to be talking about physical samples.
So it was interesting. I won't recap everything that Mark and Ruth said, but it was kind of similar findings for physical samples. Credit just doesn't really work. I really like Ruth's analogy of the, square peg, round hole, was that there are some roles that we could find a way to make them work if we really pushed it, but they didn't really capture the things that are important when managing or dealing with samples. For example, one of our key aspects is the aspect of the collector who went out and collected the sample, and that doesn't really fit anywhere within the credit roles. I've included on the slide just a little taste of what some of our mappings were, so you could see where we took the credit role, like conceptualization, and thought about where it might go, and then also how it might fit with the concept of maybe who determined the field program of where to collect the samples. Maybe that's conceptualization. But again, some of these things were not the most primary focus for our object type. And I'm not going to get into a full discussion here just because I'm aware of time, but we are trying to pick up this conversation in the physical samples cluster. And so we have a session on Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern So if you're interested in this topic specifically related to physical samples, I invite you to join our session on Thursday where we can get into a more in-depth conversation there. And we're currently working on some guidelines for publishers about samples. And that's something that will continue not just at this ESIP meeting, but in our monthly calls, which are on, I believe it's the 4th Tuesday. And the next time for the next one is also on this slide.
Thank you. And then we have learning resources from Nancy.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, so Mark covered a little bit of it in his opening remarks, talked a little bit about what could be considered a complex object in terms of learning resources. So I won't go into that too much, but we found that, again, the credit was okay. It's probably better than the other types of formats we were talking about, but it still wasn't really comprehensive enough for the kinds of complex objects, or at least research learning resources that we were looking at. Partly because a lot of times learning resources are created by one person and then adapted by another. So, or they're created by someone and then the instructor or trainer provides the context for them and so on. And also, you know, if somebody else creates the tutorials or exercises or that sort of thing, you know, as part of a resource, then, you know, associating credit with those different resources as they're collected together is a difficult thing to do. So I think the learning resource community has been a little slower than other communities to actually create citations for learning resources. I mean, even courses within the academic environment, you know, are not necessarily cited, even if they're available publicly or as open source. Much less the more informal kinds of things that you know they're available for professional development, so on and so forth. We're starting to see more of that as resources are created for certificates, for instance, and badges and so on. But we're still not quite there yet. On the other hand, the learning resource community has been working with the idea of contribution or contributors for quite a while. And that shows up in that sense. They're, you know, closer to literature, for instance, especially. But people have been using the Library of Congress MARC relator codes, you know, as a way to find out what different contributions would be. And also you're starting to see more examples on the landing pages of what kinds of contributions could be made. So what I've got is an example here on the bottom right of what the programming historian is doing in terms of resources that they're creating, which is an interesting way to do it. And then I should also mention that our data management training clearinghouse, ESIP's data management training clearinghouse has had citations for learning resources for quite a while and includes some other kinds of contributions as part of the citation. So that's interesting to look at as well. Those are part of the short courses if you're interested in looking at those. And then finally, there are other people, the RDA world in general, looking at how to provide recommendations to learning resource creators and adapters and service providers as well, in terms of documenting what's going on, the descriptions in general for learning resources, but also for authorship and contributions. And that group is coming up with both a minimal set and extended documentation. And we hope to do an application profile using a Dublin Core tabular application profile, so that can be shared and used across different environments. So that's it.
Great, thanks, Nancy. So that brings us to data. So credit seemed to work best for data products, but it still wasn't perfect. The definitions for the roles were very publication centric, and many roles that lead to a data product weren't provided in this list. And we also needed to qualify many roles to make sense of it in a purely data context, similar to what Sarah was talking about for physical samples. So for example, conceptualization was very difficult for participants to kind of wrap their heads around for data, just data in general, particularly given the credit definition, so which was ideas, formulation, or evolution of overarching research goals and aims. Despite these limitations, the breakout group that we had on this during the winter meeting was able to determine some roles that may be appropriate to include in a data citation and some roles that may be more appropriate in acknowledgements or on the landing page or elsewhere in the metadata, or in some cases that wouldn't necessarily require credit in a data publication. Now, while we were able to form these general categories for almost every role, we had folks say, well, it depends, which is very true. It depends on whether you read the credit definition literally or try to translate it for a data specific context. It depends on whether that role exists for the project in question and how much effort was required for the role and how that role impacted the data set in question. So since this exercise worked decently well for data, we decided that we wanted to continue to pursue this idea of how to give credit for data sets and to develop some guidance for the community. And that's what we'll be discussing for the rest of this session. But first, we wanted to pause and see if there are any questions about some of the work that our cluster has done so far. So we're going to pause and allow folks to type questions into the chat or raise your hand and ask a question if you have any. So I see one question from Seth. Where do things like websites and collections of visualizations fit? Which is a great question. So anybody from our cluster, does anybody want to chime in on where they see that? Websites and collections of visualizations.
I could take a crack at that. Just to push back a little bit, I think website is too generic of a term. I mean, what's on the website would make a big difference. You know, you can put data on a website, you can put a taxonomy on a website, et cetera. So I think you need to be a bit more specific about what you mean by a website. If you're just talking about a basic textual sort of description of websites, the style manuals, you know, APA, Chicago have guidelines on that. And it's basically, it's sort of like citing gray literature. You know, it's not formally peer reviewed. It's not, it doesn't have a persistent identifier. So you need to give a date of access as well as the URL. So I think there is guidance on that. But again, I think you should really think carefully about what is it you're actually citing, is that it's not just a website. And then in terms of collections of visualizations, that's a good question. And I might argue, and I'd be interested to hear what other people think, that's data. I mean, that's just, it's a higher, you know, it's a derived product. It's a higher level form of data, and that it should be cited in that same sort of fashion. And, you know, the big question that people really grapple with is, you know, at what point is something significant enough, or that you're willing to maintain enough that you're going to register a persistent identifier for it and keep that persistent identifier current. And I think it's when you cross that threshold that you have to really start thinking about what is it that what we're talking about.
Does anybody else from the cluster want to chime in there?
This is Ruth. I will agree with Mark that actually I think visualizations are a higher form of data and could easily be treated like that. In fact, Mark, I have a paper that talks about information products as a form of data, basically. And that those forms of data actually are usually the ones that are more useful to the general public and decision makers, et cetera.
We had somebody else chime in the chat. For static visualizations, we treat them as first-class objects that can be preserved and cited like other files. And if I do recall, when we first were talking, you know, Mark mentioned that we came up with those 32 different types of research artifacts. And I think we did have visualizations as one of those line items that then got kind of rolled up into one of our larger categories. And I think it was probably data that we rolled it up into. I see another question in the chat. So related to Ruth's microcredit point, how long do you go before the credit just makes no more sense? For example, when you credit something that is nested, that is in turn nested, it doesn't really mean anything anymore. Is this something to leave to authors? Ruth, would you like to respond to that? Or I guess anybody could respond to that.
Well, I note that that we haven't run into that in the ontology sense of the word, primarily because citation is one thing, but provenance is another. And that if you do both of those well, I'm not sure you can run into that problem. I mean, for example, data sets, they typically, for example, a NASA or science data set, you know, a level 2 product will refer back to the level 1 or 0 products that it was created from. And that's not, and so you can call that credit, but the product that then uses that level 2 data doesn't have to cite the zeros and ones because the level 2 product did. So from that standpoint, you use provenance as a trail instead of credit.
Thanks, Ruth. I'm seeing another question in the chat. How about services or tools like Giovanni? I think that came in after the question about where do things like websites and collections of visualizations fit?
Yeah, and I tried to answer that in the chat. I think our software and services guidelines address that. And I know I wasn't super involved in that effort. And it's unfortunate Dan's not here, but others probably know. But there was a lot of discussion as to, what's a service, what's software. Service is something that's, that you deploy from somewhere else, whereas software maybe is something that's run on your own machine. But yeah, I would recommend you check out the software and services citation guidelines on that. And I'm almost positive Giovanni was one of the use cases they looked at.
Great, thanks. Looking to see if there are any, we have a lot of good comments based on some of the questions in the chat. Let's see, Kelsey asks, curious how or if this framework deals with credit over time, for example, published revisions, open source code, web pages as they update. Does anyone want to chime in, or Kelsey, do you pipe up and ask your question?
Well, I can say that for ontologies and the microcitations, that's the whole point of the provenance part. The person who originally had the definition of this term 20 years ago was X, and then that term was deprecated because it was substantially altered by person Y, and that's the person who's now cited, but the previous version of the term is still there as something that has been deprecated.
Thanks, Ruth. Okay, so a lot of continued conversations about visualization and when a derived data product is sufficiently different from a parent to deserve its own identity. So yeah, really great points. So what we want to do now is kind of move on to a little bit about next steps and where we hope to take the cluster next. So let's see. So in order for us to develop some guidance for providing credit for data, we realize that we need to get more specific about the roles that we're using and specific about what type of credit we're talking about. Credit via the citation, credit via some acknowledgements on the landing page, or credit within the metadata. So to get more specific about the roles that we will use to help frame the guidance, we're exploring the contributor role ontology, which expands the contributor roles terminology, the credit, that we were using in the exercise last winter. And prior to this session, the Research Artifact Citation Cluster did an initial pass to trim the contributor roles ontology from over 90 roles to a slightly more manageable set of 36 roles that we thought could be particularly relevant to the development of data sets and data products. And given that this is the Research Artifact Citation Cluster, we decided that we wanted to pursue the question, what contributions warrant authorship for data, with the end goal of being able to provide guidance for determining the author list within a citation. And this may take the form kind of in the end, or what we're thinking, it might take the form of a kind of a decision tree or a worksheet that allows contributors to determine the roles that they played in a data set development, how much effort was required for that role, how much weight does that role deserve towards authorship consideration. Now, the American Psychological Association's Science Student Council developed a similar worksheet for determining authorship associated with a research manuscript. And now we understand that we will not be able to create guidance that is applicable in every use case, but the goal is to give people kind of a list of roles that might be applicable for their use case and some elements to consider in making their decision on authorship. And now we know that there will never be a perfect formula for determining authorship. There will always need to be a discussion among team members, but we hope that we can kind of provide this guidance to help facilitate those conversations. Okay, before we go further, I want to pause and for another Slido poll. And this is just a free text response, but what is the most important factor to you in considering authorship for data? So just want to kind of get our brains thinking down this path on authorship for data. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to think about that and jot down a response in the Slido poll. All right, I'm starting to see some of them come through. So we have how the person contributed, the value of contribution, value added, whether or not the data set could have been created without the input of that particular person, creative or intellectual effort, uniqueness, whether they were the collector or the creator, originality, time and quality of contribution to conceptualization and analysis, credit towards tenure, agency, not just a routine task that could have been programmatically done, but value, judgment, critical thinking applied, being applied in actions. We have level of effort, whoever contributed to the work, value, another value add, responsibility for the creation of the data, somebody who's a creator or collector, long-term preservation, the impact of the person's contribution to the final product. So those are all really great thoughts on how to, what different factors are out there for us to consider. And there's certainly a lot to consider. And we see in here some mention of like roles. And so, yeah, this is great to get us thinking through that. And we're going to continue with this in our breakout activity. And then another one just came in, data integrity and longevity. All right, thank you for participating in that. So to reach our kind of end goal of providing some guidance for developing a data set author list, we are starting to think of the questions that we could ask to people for people to consider when they're thinking this through. And so our first question that our cluster sort of came up with was, what role or roles did that person have that contributed to the development of the data product? And we saw that in some of those responses, right? Were they creator or things like that? And is that a role that might be considered for authorship of the data product? And here's where the contributor role ontology comes into play and the subset that the cluster selected. So if the person had a role that might be considered for authorship, it's just that, consideration, not necessarily that they automatically deserve to be an author. There are still other factors to account for beyond role, as we saw in some of the responses for the Slido. But before we go further, I'll give you an example of a role from the CRO, the contributor roles ontology, that we did not end up including in our subset, and that's website role. So according to the definition, this role includes the creation or refinement of a website served from a single web domain. Now, even if the website is that is maintained is relevant to the data product, we kind of see that role in and of itself not really necessarily qualifying for authorship of the data product. So just to give you an idea of some of the roles that we sort of trimmed off of the ontology. So the next question, so did that role happen as part of the current project in question, or was it part of a precursor to the project? So for example, let's think about the protocol creation role. And you can see that we have an example of some of these roles here, and that's the second one here. Now, if a member of a project team created a novel protocol specifically for this project, then that person may deserve to be considered for authorship of the data product. If, however, that person created the protocol for another purpose, and then the protocol is being used or slightly adapted for this new project, then that person and their protocol should be cited, but not necessarily included in the author list for the current project's data product, unless that person contributed significantly in a different role as well. So as we go through, we're going to kind of step through each of these roles within the contributor role ontology. We want you to keep this concept in mind of was that role happening for this particular project, or did it kind of happen before this project? Okay, so we determined that the role happened as part of the current project. The next question is, how important is it to consider this role for authorship for the particular data type in question? And this is the point where we're looking for your input. And we've developed a breakout activity to begin to understand how this community would answer this question for the roles that we've selected and the data types that we've selected. So the cluster realizes that different roles may be more important for different types of data. So we brainstormed a list of data types to help get us started. So I have those shown on the slide. We have remote sensing, like data from remote sensing, in situ data, data collected through a big field campaign, data from physical samples, laboratory data, citizen science data, and simulation data. And for the rest of this session, we want to get into groups around these data types to answer a couple of questions. So we want you all to start thinking about a data type that you're familiar with, and we'll ask you to join that breakout group in just a few minutes. But essentially the questions that we want you to think about are, in general, recognizing that every data product is somewhat unique. How important is it to consider each role in our contributor role ontology subset for authorship for your particular data type? And we're asking you to kind of group these into 4 categories that I'm also showing on the slide. So we have NA, which means this role would never or very rarely be considered for authorship of this data type. Low, meaning that it should be considered, but the person may need to have a number of other low-level roles to qualify for authorship. Medium, meaning somewhere in the middle. And high, meaning that this role should be given high consideration for authorship. we also want you to discuss what other factors are important to include in authorship discussions for this type of data. For example, the level of effort, accountability, uniqueness of the contribution, some of those same things that we asked in the Slido poll. Are there ones that are specific to your data type, or just other things that you and your breakout group think are important? And I want to clarify, I see a note in the comments from Mark that project is kind of equivalent here to a team producing the data sets. So yeah, thank you for helping me clarify that, Mark. Okay, so let me move on here. So for the breakout groups, we've set up a spreadsheet with tabs for each of these data types. So you can see we have remote sensing, in situ, big field campaign all along the bottom. So different tab for each of the data types. And each tab lists each of our selected 36 roles from the contributor role ontology, along with their descriptions. And then in columns C through Q, what we would like everyone to do is, so each member of the breakout group, we're asking that they grab their own column. So where it says kind of participant and then a number, you can fill in your name. Or if you don't want to provide your name, you could call yourself something else, but do something to claim the column. And what we're going to do is we want you to work through each of these roles kind of on your own. And then in each cell for your column, there's a drop-down list where you can select NA, low, medium, or high for the question, how important is it to consider this role for authorship for this data type? So if you're talking about remote sensing data, how important is, say, the conceptualization role towards that end data product? And then for the purposes of this activity, we behind the scenes have assigned each of these a value from 0 to 3. And then in the last column, so over here, average importance, we're going to average how important each role is across all of the members of your breakout group. And then this will allow your group to in the end, sort your roles to determine which roles seem to be most important for your data type. And then when we come back together, we'd like each group to share their top roles so that we can see if they differ across data types. So, remembering kind of one of our hypotheses was that it's possible that the roles that are important towards authorship may differ based on these different data types. And so we want to see if, based on this community's experiences, if that's true or not. And then after you kind of go through the 36 roles individually and then do a sort, if there's time, we'd also like you to discuss that question about other factors that are important to include in authorship discussions for your data type. And in the notes document for this session, we have space towards the bottom where you can document your thoughts on this question, as well as any other thoughts about the activity as you and your group are kind of discussing things. I just also want to say, remember our assumptions. When considering the importance of the role, we're assuming that the person in the role was part of the project team and performed the role specifically for this project, or for this project or this particular data product. There's a tab in the Google Sheets document as well with instructions to kind of remind you of what we're doing, kind of basically just written out what I just explained. But I want to pause and see if we have questions before we actually move into the breakout groups. And I'll ask also my cluster members if they understand the ask here, and see if my explanation was sufficient or if I should try again. Okay, so Bob is saying, what is the URL for the Google Sheet? Very good. We have it in our Kiko chat space, but I will also grab, oh, Mark got it.
Mark got it.
Mark?
I have a question too, Madison.
Yes.
In terms of the sorting, I was thinking of something else when you talked about that. Could you go over the sorting? That so
Sure,
after
sure.
everybody, yeah.
Yeah, after everybody, let me move this over here. Maybe actually pop this actual spreadsheet here. So we have some instructions. So yeah, so sorting, once everybody goes through and does the ranking, that last column will, which is column R, I believe, unless you have more than 15 participants and need to add columns. But it will produce an average, it'll be a number.
Okay.
But what you can do then is kind of select rows 3 through 38, go to data, sort range, and sort by column R. And you'll do a Z to A sort. So hopefully we will get the highest ranked roles for your data type. And so that will kind of help us with this question, which roles are most important for your breakout groups data type? And then if you do have time after that, what other factors are important to include in the authorship discussions for your breakout groups data type?
Thank you.
And okay, what's considered as simulation data? Does it include synthesized derived data based on remote sensing in situ data? So when I think of simulation data, I think of data that's derived from kind of models where there would be input from some of these other data types. Yeah, and I'll pause and see if the rest of our cluster agrees with that statement. Yep, model data. And let me go back. So can we define all of the data types? So I don't have a formal definition, but I would say remote sensing, things from satellites, drones, things like that would fall under remote sensing. In situ data, so data where you're going out into the field and collecting data. Big field campaign, and Mark, I'm actually going to have you, since you had a very nice definition for big field campaign. Would you like to chime in here?
Sure. So big field campaign, and this could include like an oceanographic cruise. It's where a whole bunch of data is being collected in a variety of ways. So it could include in situ remote sensing, samples, everything, but it's a coordinated campaign to go out and collect data in a coordinated way. And so it could be a bunch of people on the ground measuring things while aircraft or drones are flying overhead, and you might make specially derived satellite products for it. So it's a coordinated campaign to collect a bunch of data around a theme.
Thanks, Mark. Then we have data from physical samples. So there is there could be a little bit of overlap among these groups. So just keep that in mind. They're not like nice, tidy little bins. But so you go out and you collect physical samples and then derive some data from those physical samples. Laboratory data, so you're working in a lab and analyzing samples or data like that. So the data that's coming out of that lab. Citizen science data, so you have a large collection of folks who are going out and collecting data kind of as volunteers and submitting them back to a larger effort. And then simulation data, produced from models.
So should we now all put our choice, what we want, in the chat? Or how do you want
So there's a new feature in Zoom which will actually allow us all to choose our own breakout room. So
yes. And I will make them available as soon as you tell me how long you would like them to be open for.
So we will have them open for, can we make it like 23 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Madison, how long will the breakout groups be operating?
Yep, 23 minutes.
Okay, so we have 35 lines to get through in 23 minutes.
Yep, so you have to move through pretty quickly.
Okay.
So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a breakout rooms button. You should be able to click that and then choose to join. You may need to hover over sort of to the right of the name of the room to join. I can't imagine exactly what it looks like right now, but if you have any questions, I can help move people.
And then you'll call us back automatically, right? We don't have to worry about the
Yes.
time, right? Okay, sounds
Yep.
good.
And it looks like maybe Bob still has a question.
Yes, thanks. So when we break out in our groups, are we supposed to be discussing these as we go through them or just working individually?
So at first, work individually since we don't have a lot of time, so you can kind of just read through each line. And then at the end, once everybody has kind of had a chance to rank them, then you can have a discussion about which ones. And of course, if you have questions or something along the way, you can have that discussion as well.
Oh, great, thank you.
Sorry,
All right.
Megan, how do I go into my room?
Do you see the breakout rooms button?
Uh-huh.
To the right of the name of the room, if you hover there should be a join button.
Oh, I
believe.
said it. Yep, gotcha. Okay.
So a live look-in says there are 10 people in the physical samples room right now. Very popular. In situ data, it looks like big failed campaign is a little smaller. Citizen science data is a little smaller. Simulation data, there's one lone person, unfortunately. Same with lab data. So if anybody's on the fence.
So, Madison, do you need me to go to a room? And if so, which one?
Yeah, good question. So I'm looking here
Yep.
and it looks like Rob Casey is in situ data. Mark is in big field campaign. Sarah is in physical samples. Lab data, there's just one person in there. Citizen data, Nancy's there. And so if you wanted to hop into either simulation or lab data,
And then remote sensing has just one lone person too.
Yeah.
I'll do remote sensing because actually that's probably where most of my experience has been.
What are the
Okay, I'm going to send you there, Ruth.
Okay, great.
what are the remaining choices then?
So there are two lone lab data and simulation data just have one person in them right now. I think lab data will be, simulation data would be my recommendation if that's not too unwanted for you.
I'm sorry, which one?
Simulation data,
Okay, you can put me in there. How do I
I'll
get
send
in?
you there. I'll send you there so you don't even have to do anything.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, Megan. This is Yashin. Can you send me
Hi,
to
Yashin.
simulation?
Will do.
Thanks.
Will do. So there is just one person in lab data, but that's one of the community fellows. So I'm guessing she can regroup in another space if she needs to.
Okay.
Anybody else need help getting somewhere, or are you happy just hanging out here?
And don't feel like you need to be an expert in anything to join the breakout group.
I think sometimes people just want to see the synthesis at the end, so no problem if you're otherwise engaged right now. I'm going to pause the recording.
The historical archive perspective, we have lots of data sets where we know very little and we can discover more by digging, and how many of those credits are important enough to spend the time and money on.
Right. Yeah, and this is why we're really trying to get that top level, this authorship, with a handful-ish of people who, were uniquely contributing, that without them, the data set would not exist, that sort of thing. Irreplaceable sort of characters, I think.
All right, we have folks returning.
And unfortunately, the calculations didn't work.
Yeah, same for us.
Yes, I realized that about halfway through that I had screwed up a little bit there, and I tried to go in and correct it. So I'm hoping that I corrected it for most of you, but we'll just have a quick discussion of what you guys talked about in your group. If any comments about the activity itself came up, and then we can take a look after the fact about kind of the top roles. But we just have about a minute per group. So I kind of want to run through and just see if folks would be willing to report out on how their breakout activity went. And what.
That'd be great. I'll start. This is Ruth. Tyler and I were on remote sensing. She's from NOAA. I mostly have done NASA. And we agreed on a lot of things. And then we totally disagreed on a few things based on the factor that NOAA is very operational and is into continuity. And whereas NASA is into innovation. And so things like study designs and instrument development and things that in NASA, if you're the person who proposed a new instrument to fly somewhere and it actually got chosen, that's a big deal. You're definitely going to be the major author on lots of papers. And you're probably the person who did the algorithm design because you're the one who knows that instrument. Whereas at NOAA, continuity is a big deal. So, so none of that was at all important. So
that's interesting.
So that was the big difference between the two of us. Otherwise, we pretty much had the same kind of scores.
Okay, cool, great. Thank you very much for sharing. Let's move to big field campaigns.
Yeah, so there were 5 of us in our group. We got the whole spreadsheet filled out, so yay team. We didn't have a lot of time for discussion. The only real gap maybe that we saw was, and it's captured in maybe one of the roles, but the person who basically wrote the proposal to get the thing funded, and by that, we're assuming that that person didn't just write a good proposal, but that they did a lot of design work in terms of what the field campaign would actually be like. And I think that's captured in some roles, but it's, getting a campaign funded. It's sort of like what Ruth was just talking about, where the NASA investigator that leads a new mission is the shizzle. And that's a similar sort of real deal here. We found a bit of, so the methodology or the field protocols are really critical in a field campaign. And we saw a little bit of redundancy or confusion across some of the different roles that talk about that. And then again, like you talked about at the beginning, Madison, in some cases, they might take a methodology off the shelf. This is how you sample snow. And then that's not an authorship role, that's just a citation role. In other cases, they might have designed an entirely new methodology to do things. So teasing apart those different roles around methodology, experimental design, protocols, I think was the big gap for us. And that's about as far as we got.
Great, thanks.
Others, please chime in if I missed anything. Okay, thanks.
Let's move on to citizen science.
Okay, I'll start with that. Yeah, so the first question we had was, what is citizen science? It has a lot of characteristics that the same kind of thing that Mark described with the big field data, but finally came to the fact that we're just going to choose that most of the design and all aspects of the project would be participatory. So it's sort of one of the things that was missing, I'll say it this way, is sort of the collaborative role. And so that came to the question of, what is science in general for citizen science? So that was an interesting perspective. Then you have to think about other things like, did people bring expertise? What was the level of effort that people contributed, et cetera, et cetera. And then one of the things that was really interesting was Kelsey talked about that her project, where what they do is talk about both nomination. Other people can nominate someone to be, to get that kind of credit. And then the people who have been nominated have the option of saying, oh, I'm okay, I don't need credit, or no, I need to be anonymous. There are sort of other factors that come in that relate to the choice of becoming an author or not. And so that, I guess those are the main things that are important. Anybody else want to contribute to anything I've forgotten?
Just to emphasize again that the nature of the project, it may be that participants wish to remain anonymous because of the sensitivity of the data collected.
Right,
so.
right, yeah. Thanks.
And that was a great recap, Nancy. And the other thing that we mentioned early on was we could really use an "it depends."
Yeah, that's right. I forgot. It depends.
It really does depend. The level of importance really depends on a lot of things. It's what the project is and what kind of data and is a simulation really useful for this or not. So doing this in a vacuum is, it's going to be theoretical, but the application of it is going to be very, very project dependent.
Yeah, that makes sense. Any other thoughts from that group?
Just that examples will be really important when it comes to the guidance from us.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's move on to data from physical samples.
So we had a slight mutiny in our group where I think we had about 10 people in the group, and the majority decided to focus on samples and sample metadata themselves rather than sample data. So if you look at our tab, we've got it separated out into these two groups. Unfortunately, the column Q doing the calculations wasn't working even before we separated into the two groups. So we manually went through and just highlighted ones where we saw large discrepancies across the groups. And at that point, we've run out of time. So we didn't really get to go into any in-depth discussion. But I thought it was really interesting, the one that we did talk about, original draft preparation role. I think it was Mickey who pointed out that she put it this as low because, or sorry, high. And there was some dependency on that being like, well, okay, well, only if you have another rule that relates to this, that is also important. Because if you're just doing data entry and you aren't doing any scientific thought and just copying things from a piece of paper into a database, well, that's not part of the scientific quality of it. And that last bit is my words, not hers, sorry. So, so hopefully I'm not misrepresenting the conversation, but I think that's something that came up in my mind too with a few others, and maybe for others as well, is that the connection to another role and not just the role being chosen.
Awesome. Not noting this down. Great, thank you very much. Let's move on to in situ data.
You want to do this one?
You're kind of the ringleader, Matt.
So I'll just say that overall, there was a lot of agreement in the group, and we found it was, I think, quite a lot of just, uniformly one way or the other on the rows. We also had the "it depends" conversation, and saying that depending on what the product is, some of these roles might be fundamentally important. So if you're building a data set about validating an in situ instrument, then it's a very different thing than if you're, not necessarily focused on that instrument itself. So there were a lot of roles that were in the middle, marked either low or medium, that could very well be high, depending on the type of project and the type of data set. That said, when you look at our thing, we had conceptualization, discovery, and writing original role draft all as uniformly high. And then we had another big set around creating protocols and doing statistical analysis and data integration and data transformation. So all the things that are involved in primarily building the data set and the intellectual product. And the mediums and lows were all around potentially, important things that, again, if you're the primary person, or if this is one of many roles you play, it could lead to an authorship situation. Yeah, so we had a lot, probably like 7 or 8 that were almost uniformly high or high and medium. and then many that were medium and low combinations. But there was remarkable agreement, which was really cool.
Awesome, yeah, it's good to hear. Okay, real quick, we'll move on to the last one that had a group of folks in there, and that's the simulation data.
Yeah, so we had 4 of us there, and actually we spent most of our time talking about the different roles because we found that there were similarities amongst the questions, and one suggestion we have is that if there are 2 areas that are close to each other in terms of interpretability, perhaps they should be near each other on the spreadsheet so that you can look at them within the context of each other. Another issue that was brought up, and we put a column for notes, I should say, too, because some assumptions that we agreed on for the few we talked about, we put notes in there in this separate column. The other issue is that was raised is where some of us thought that a particular one was not applicable, and others thought it was perhaps high. The 0 was just not counting at all. Perhaps that should be like a negative in that case. And so that they're evening out the situation a bit. It looks like Seth has his hand raised and he was in our group.
Yeah, I just want to add that we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to interpret these roles as they apply to simulation data. And it was hard. So I wonder if maybe that points towards maybe that simulation data is different enough that it needs yet another set of roles to be considered that's different from the other kinds of data collection.
Okay, yeah, that's a good thought. I know that other groups, I think, might have also had a similar discussion about how do we interpret this particular role for data. So again, probably not perfect, the ontology that we're using, but maybe workable in some data types.
I think less workable for simulation than others. We struggled more with it, I think is
okay. Yeah, good. I've noted that down. Okay, so we're 2 minutes over. So I just really quickly, we're gonna continue working on this in our cluster. So if you're interested in helping to develop guidelines or continue this conversation, we'll probably take a deeper look into those spreadsheets at actual how those roles shook out. Since that was my bad with the column R, I messed that up a little bit, but we will figure that out before our next cluster meeting. So please do join our cluster if you're interested in continuing this discussion. And thank you very much for participating in this activity. We really appreciate your input and and hope to see you at our next meeting.